I've been with the platoon several weeks, 3 weeks maybe, and on a search and destroy mission. And this specific mission was to remove the villagers from a village and create a free fire zone because it was heavily populated with Viet Cong.
Yeah.
And at the time, if the villagers were forced to support the Viet Cong or if they did it because they wanted to, at the time, I really didn't care. I just knew that the Viet Cong were being taken care of and they were trying to kill me and my platoon members. And so, yes, we removed the villagers. We did burn the village. It made me reflect, even as I just had been only 19 about a month. And, here I am burning somebody's home and something that I never thought I would do. So that's, a memory that stays with you, and especially my interaction with the old woman in the hut that had no legs, that I carried her out to be with her family.
Yeah.
So they're heart wrenching, but you got to look at, I'm there, at that point, I'm there to survive and help my brother survive. And that's where you're at that point in time.
You're referring to a passage in the memoir. If I'll ask you if you're willing to share that story about the woman in her hooch, but I think in that part of the memoir you kind of reflect on, the question what had become of me. Here I am. I'm a teenager in the world of war, and just one of the questions I come back to again and again is, what does war do to people? How does war change people? So could you share that story when you go into that village and you have this interaction with the old woman in her hooch, and you learn something as that story unfolds in front of your eyes, and then in your memoir you reflect on, what you don't dwell on it, but you just kind of briefly reflect on that question, like, what is war doing to us? What is war doing to me? But can you just share that story real quick?
Sure. That's the village that we were told to move all the occupants out and destroy the village. And it was one of the last huts I went into, and there was chaos going on. The villagers were screaming and crying, and soldiers were hollering and screaming, giving orders. And I go in this hooch, and there's an old woman cowering in the corner, and I'm guessing, 70 years old. Of course, when you're 19, everybody looks old.
Yeah.
And but I'm guessing she's about, 70 years old, and she's cowering in a corner and grayish hair. Her lips and teeth are black from betel nut. And so I'm yelling at her to get out of the hooch and move out with the rest of the residents. And she won't move. So I point my weapon at her and, turn on the meanest look, I guess, that I can turn on. And I'm yelling at her. And then she kind of just hobbles on two stubs. And I realized at that moment, I said, my God, to myself, I think I kind of wrote, what kind of person am I becoming, or something to that effect, losing your humanity. And so that's when I reached down and I picked her up and I carried her out to be with the other villagers. And when I was carrying her out, she was asking for certain items from her hooch, and I said, no way. And I took her out. And then I went back and got some of the items she was pointing at. And I don't recall those today, but I did get some of those items and I gave them to her. And then that's when I walked away. And in reflection, you kind of think about, okay, what am I going to become from all this? Because again, I've only been with the platoon for several weeks, 3 weeks maybe. And so it was kind of heart-wrenching when you're dealing with the civilian population. But again, at the end of the day, you become pretty immune to it all. You have to, if you're going to survive and if your brothers are going to survive.
Yeah, you turn off, and which is another theme, but something else that you discuss in the memoir. Well, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts just on this theme. How does war affect a person? So how would you say that the Glenn Haney who flies out of Vietnam in 1970 is different from the Glenn Haney who flew into Vietnam in 1969? How are you a different person? And I guess I guess the question is, that would hold. I mean, how how did that year in Vietnam change you? What lasting impact did it have on you?
I think the easiest answer to that, and I think I wrote that in the chapter when I talked about the donut dolly, is, I came over as an 18-year-old and I left as a 35-year-old.
Mm,
And that's how war ages you. It put 20 years on me. And you're not the same person. You'll never be the same person. You see things that you never think you would see. That's when I talk a lot of times about the American people. They don't have a clue. No one has a clue what a soldier has to face. It's not just the combat, it's the daily fear. It's when you wake up in the morning and you eat your breakfast and you look around your platoon brothers and you say, who's going to die today? That's your thought. And then you're walking, every step you're taking, you're thinking, am I going to die today, or is the guy behind me going to die? And that's the kind of fear you live with. And then when it turns dark, then it's really, so it's, yeah, and you live with that the rest of your life. I mean, today, it's kind of ironic, kind of funny. I have 5 children, 4 boys, and even today, if there's a backfire or a loud noise, I can actually hit the ground. And the boys always joked with me and laughed about it. And now I have 3 of my sons served in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they no longer think that's funny. They have a better idea of why I still react that way.
How often does Vietnam in one way or another come up in your mind? Would you say it comes up in one way or another every day?
Every day. I think it was around Thanksgiving. It was on in Hill 411. We did have a mess hall set up there, and I was going through the line to get my meal, and I had, loaded up my plate, and it was to get the dessert. And there was donut dollars there. And the donut dollars, they're there to interact and try to remind you of home. And I understand why they're there. I appreciate why they're there. I respect their bravery for being there. But it just, with all the 2 members that had died, I think up to that point, 10 guys had been killed and 11 wounded. And so it's just, I wasn't a happy person. And so, when she had, and I don't smile a lot. I don't smile a lot today. I smile a lot today either. So when she asked me to smile, I just kind of just took me over the edge, I think. And I was extremely rude to her and used an explicit word. I said, just give me the pie and let me move on. And so I regret that to this day. She didn't deserve for anyone to be that snappy, cruel, mean, when she's just trying to remind you of home and let you know the people are thinking about you. So I always regretted that, and that's when I apologized to her in the book. So I don't know if she ever read it. Don't know who she was, but there's an apology there. So she ever sees it, remembers the incident. I'm sorry.
You mentioned that one of the things that happened to you in Vietnam, just personally, is that you lost whatever religious faith you had. Now, I don't recall that you say whether whatever religious faith you had going into Vietnam was very intense, whether you were an observant practitioner or not, but you say that you did lose your faith. Could you talk about that a little bit?
It was after August 15th. I mean, it's been wavering up to that point, but after August 15th, I actually had an out-of-body experience, which some people would want to say, okay, now I'm going to be religious, but that's not what happened to me. But we had 4 men killed and 7 wounded that day. And in all reflection on August the 16th, I can't see, if there's a God, how can you let that happen? And we can, there's all kinds of answers that the religious institutions have for questions like that. I don't accept them. So to this day, no, I'm not religious. I don't believe there's a God there just going to take care of anyone. And that's, it's just the way it is. It changed me. Besides my youth, I lost my belief in God while I was there in Vietnam.
You lost your youth. You lost your belief in God. August 1969, then mid-August 1969, then is clearly a turning point in your life in a major way. and we'll talk about that. We'll come to that soon. You mentioned your brother earlier. You and your brother go into the Army about the same time. The Army has a policy. Am I right about that?
Yes, my brother entered the Army 1 week after me, but by the time we went through our basic and advanced individual training, he caught up because they accelerated his class. And then we went to Vietnam. They had a policy, no two brothers in country. It wasn't a regulation, but it was a policy. And so when we departed from home to go to Fort Lewis to end process and get our gear to go to Vietnam, I met with the commander, reception commander, and I told him, I said, okay, my brother and I are on the same set of orders to go to Vietnam. And he said, the policy is you got to have a brother in country. You got one in country. And of course, obviously I didn't. He stood next to me. So that got nowhere. So yeah, we got on the plane. We sat next to each other on the plane and we flew to Vietnam together. He was 20 and I was 18 at that time.
Wow. And how long does he stay in Vietnam until an officer finally does something and then he goes to Korea?
Yeah, we were in July for approximately 6 weeks, maybe 7. And then he went to Korea, and then I went to join my infantry platoon.
So you serve you serve in Vietnam, he serves in South Korea. My original question was, if you could flip that situation, would you? In other words, if you could go back, do it again, and have the chance to go to South Korea rather than stay in Vietnam, would you do that? But let me actually change the question a little bit. Let's change the scenario completely. And let's say your brother goes to South Korea, and then you go to West Germany, because we have forces there too. So this is just one of those mental exercises, but if you could roll the tape back and, oh, okay, well, so now Vietnam isn't even part of the mix. I won't even go to Vietnam. I'll go to West Germany. If you could roll the tape back, would you go with that option of going to West Germany?
No, I would have gone to Vietnam.
Right, and which is the answer I anticipated. And so, the next question is one that I know that you can't really answer because somebody who hasn't been there just can't understand. But this is something that I hear a lot from combat veterans. They'll talk about the terribleness of it, the awfulness of it, all of which makes perfect sense. And then I'll ask them, well, if I had a potion that all you needed to do was sip this potion and all of those memories would go away, would you sip the potion? And with one exception, they've always said no. Why would you still choose Vietnam?
Well, I think the real answer is I wouldn't have the brothers that I have today. The guys that came home, there's many of those I still in contact with today from First Platoon, and we're not as close as Mike and I are, but I would never have known these men. Even the men that died, I would not have known them. Through my efforts to get their names out, I've met, like Jerry Ossendahl, I've met his wife. Rebel, I've talked to his wife. Reynolds, I've talked to his wife. I've talked to nieces, uncles, mothers of the guys that died. I would never had the opportunity to talk to them before. And some of the experiences that I've had that made me the person that I am, hopefully I'm a good person still, despite war, came from those days. Because everything's a learning experience. And I wouldn't give those up for anything. I would not.
What you were just saying reminds me of another kind of thing that I notice a lot, and you just discussed this strong bond between combatants. And I noticed that in your memoir, in either the memoir and the novel, I don't recall that you spend very much time dwelling on international communism and things like that. The war is very much about, me and like 100 yards in every direction. That's the war. And you're not reflecting on Marxism, and you're not reflecting on politics and all this stuff. And so, what I often hear veterans say is, when you're in a combat situation, the war is about you and the guy next to you. That's pretty much what the war is about. So feel free to respond to any of this, but that strong sense of camaraderie. But then at which you discuss and you describe and you just shared it. But then also in the memoir, you talk about having to kind of put up a wall and to create distance at the same time, because as you said earlier, you wake up and you don't know who's going to make it today or who might not make it today, who might not still be here at sunset, or who might not still be here at sunrise. So it seems like you've got these two things going on. One, this powerful sense of camaraderie, and yet also a need to kind of put up a wall so that you don't get too close. Do you think, first of all, I mean, is that description accurate? And then how do you possibly make sense of that?
I think initially my first, 4 or 5, 6 months, up through August, I got close with all my platoon members, and they're your brothers. And you're right, in combat, you're not fighting for the flag, you're not fighting for the president, you're not fighting, for apple pie. You're fighting for you and the guy next to you to survive. I mean, that's what's going through your brain, nothing else. I mean, at the end of the day, before I went to Vietnam, did I believe I was fighting communism? Yes. Today, do I believe I was fighting communism? Yes. But when I was fighting, had nothing to do with communism. It had to do to protect myself and my brothers. And so I was close with everybody. And then from losing, for me, so many people, when the guy was wounded and sent back to the States, we never knew what happened to him.
Mm.
We never knew if he lived or died. So you notice in my book, I asked 3 of the platoon members that were wounded and went home to write about their experience, so I could share that with everybody, because I didn't know either what they went through when they were wounded. And they went to the hospital in July, and then to Japan, and then to an Army hospital in the States.
Yeah.
So with that said, we were all close. So, around about September, when we started getting replacements for all the men we had lost in August, it wasn't a conscious decision. It just happened. I wasn't going to be attached to anyone anymore. And it's just the way I did it. Like I said, I didn't think about it. I didn't say, okay, I'm not getting close to you, dude, move back. It's just, I didn't get as close to the men. And I met a lot of these guys that I served with after, they came in from September on. And I don't have memories of them like I do of the guys early, prior to their arrival. And that's something different with Vietnam too. We were dealing with individual replacements every day. Somebody's rotating out, not virtually every day, but most, somebody's rotating out and then somebody rotates in. And that's how we got our replacements to fill the platoon. And so, yeah, after the August, I just would not get close to anybody.
There's a theme that keeps coming up, kind of mid-August 1969 is kind of that turning point in a number of different ways. And so before then, these strong bonds are building. You've got, combat incidents and you lose fellow soldiers before mid-August, right? But mid-August is really kind of the crucible. And then after that is when, understandably, you kind of hold folks at a distance. Well, let's come to those dates. August 13th, let's just start with August 13th. That's a major day in your life. What happens on that day? August 13th, 1969. What happens on that day?
Well, on August 13th, we've been assigned to be a task force. We're with, I believe it was the Troop of the Cav and tanks and Bravo Company and our company, Alpha Company. Our platoon and my squad, second squad, is the right flank security for the task force, and I am the point man for that position. And it was, I guess, right about noon on the August the 13th. I told the platoon to hold up, and I moved across a trench, and I had spotted a enemy soldier peering out of what appeared to be a bunker. And I don't know why I just didn't shoot. I called out to him to come here, and of course he ran, and I fired on him, and then all hell broke loose, and we had hit a major ambush, and it was the platoon that were behind me where all the firing is happening, or to my right, about 20 or 30 meters, and as the firing's going on, several enemy soldiers broke out of the brush running towards me, and I took those soldiers out. And I had a soldier behind me fire at me, and from the trench, and I had to take him out and then get back to the platoon. And that's where I discovered Jerry, Rebel, and Swindle killed in the main part of the ambush.
How long did that whole action last?
Well, we actually fought the enemy all day. We fought all the way through the night, and we had call in artillery and gunships, and we had to go through several different avenues to try to get the dead out. Frank Brown was critically wounded. He was the M79 grenade launcher individual, and we had to give him first aid and move him out to be dust off. The tracks, I lost a couple tracks, and their crew were wounded or killed.
The APCs, you mean?
APC. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, the APCs. So, and then after, earlier we had put all our rucksacks on the APCs, and we were traveling light. And so the APCs were, when it was getting closer to dusk, we're given the order to report back to the fire base. So they dumped our rucksacks, and we had to spend, right before dark, crawling out to get our rucksacks while still under fire. And then we had to move immediately because the gunships and Cobras were coming in to fire their miniguns and rockets. And so we lay there about all night. And I talked about that night too when we were walking down the trail, and it was already getting dark, and there was a Vietnamese woman and child just hiding in the elephant grass. And I turned my weapon on, not realizing that was a woman and child. And fortunately, in time, I realized it was a woman and a child and didn't fire. So I just passed it back to, hey, there's civilians up here, and we kept on moving.
How old do you think that child was?
Probably 6.
The reason I asked that is that if he or she is still alive, then that person's probably in his or her early 50s.
Yes,
late
correct.
50s with these memories. Sometimes I ask veterans, when combat starts, when the firefight starts, what are you thinking? And the answer I always get is nothing. You're not thinking anything. Just your training takes over, your adrenaline kicks in, and you almost become a machine in a way. Is that right?
That is correct. I mean, that's how I feel about it. Because even when I try to write about it, I'm wondering, am I filling in gaps? Because you're focused on what you're doing. Nothing to your left, nothing to your right. Your adrenaline is unbelievable, and so you hope your training kicks in, and then your gut instinct of what you should or should not do, and it's just pure focus. You talk about these athletes, how focused they are when they catch a ball, throw a ball, whatever. They don't know what focus is until they're in combat.
How many hours would you say this whole thing goes on August 13th?
Probably 7.5, 8 hours, somewhere in there.
What happens to you physically, psychologically, when you realize, okay, after now these hours that have gone by of this incredible intensity, okay, now it's done. What happens to you then at that moment when you say, okay, it's done now? What happens to you as a person at that moment when you realize that you made it through, and that now, you can maybe lower your guard a little bit?
Well, it's, I think exhaustion would be the best word to describe. You feel exhausted. But for that particular, August 13th, we're talking, we set up, we never dug foxholes or anything. We're just laying on the ground, Mike and I next to each other, and we're still waiting for the enemy to come at us that night. So it really wasn't over as far as we were concerned. We weren't hit that night, but we laid there all night long. Mike would doze, I would watch, and then I wake Mike up and he would watch and I'll doze. And the other 2 members were doing the same thing. And so, you're up all night also just tense, waiting for the enemy to come to you. So everything hasn't hit you yet. And I think I write about it. Actually, for me, it was like August 16th. It was after the 13th, after the 15th, when everything just kind of really just hit me. And
Of what had happened.
what had happened those 2 or 3 days.
So August 13th, August 15th, we'll talk about the 15th in a second. What happens in the 14th?
Well, on the 14th, we consolidate, and of course we're missing our platoon sergeant and our squad leader. So Mike and I try to fill in and get the squad organized and moving. And so we're moving in the area where there's suspected a lot of enemy bunkers and tunnels, and so the supply actually brought out or flew out several cases of concussion grenades that we had loaded up with. They brought out a dog to sniff out the tunnels. I was kind of amazed that the dog handler said, when I said, "Hey, I found a tunnel, how did the dog go?" And he goes, "No, the dog don't go in tunnels. He finds them," which I thought was kind of idiotic because we could find tunnels too. So, but we had to go in them if needed. So that particular day, we weren't really going in tunnels. We found tunnels, and we found quite a few in that area. And so we were throwing grenades in each tunnel opening, concussion grenades to either collapse or kill if there's enemy soldiers in there.
So still pretty high intensity.
It was. I mean, you still didn't know where the enemy was.
Right.
We didn't know how big the force was. We anticipated it was a big force because of the amount of weapons that were firing at us, and in the 51 caliber machine gun placements and things like that. So we anticipated it was a larger force than we have dealt with in the past. It's like we were on the hill, building the hill. We got mortared virtually every night. We got zappers coming in, blowing bunkers. So recoilless rifles firing at us. So enemy soldiers trying to penetrate the wire. So all those happened, those 30 days. But the 13th and 15th was probably more intense than what we experienced there.
And what were the key events of the 15th?
Well, the 15th, again, I was walking point because I was, the point man for the platoon. So whenever it was our turn to walk point, I normally walk point. I felt confident that I knew what I was doing and did a good job at walking point. And so we moved through a hedgerow and into an open field. We're heading towards the river. It was about 1 o'clock, I believe, maybe 2. And for some reason, I just knew the enemy was somewhere. I felt it. Smelled it. Yeah, and it's just a sixth sense you have. And I had turned around and waved at the platoon and yelled, "Spread out." And at that moment, 250-pound bombs exploded. I wrote in the book 1, but when I found the battalion logs, I learned there was 2 that went off that day. So 2 250-pound bombs that went off, and they killed 4 of the platoon members, Anderson, Carey, Ponce, and Mitchell, and then wounded 7 others, including myself that day.
Yeah.
And that's where I had the out-of-body experience, because when the bomb went off, and I believe it was to my front, I didn't get any shrapnel, but it blew me back about 30 feet and ripped my weapon and gear from me. And what I realized happened was I was sitting in a tunnel, and it was like air conditioning, and I heard murmuring voices and light at one end. But when I looked down, I could see the ground, and I saw all my platoon members that were wounded or killed. I heard the moans, the cries for their mother. It was just, God, it was just unbelievable, the carnage. And Ronald Owens gave me CPR and brought me back. And so I survived from that. They say from the concussion, I got a TBI, and they said from the concussion, my organs just shut down.
Wow. How long did that whole experience last? Here we're talking about the out of body experience. How much time do you think passed while you were experiencing that?
Yeah, the doctors asked me that too, and I say a couple minutes. I really don't know. I mean, you're looking at, combat situations, so sometimes minutes seems like hours, or hours can seem like minutes. So I would say, 2 or 3 minutes, probably 4 max.
So you and the others are medevac, is that right?
Well, I helped medevac everybody else. I helped carry Paul Ponce off the field, Joe Mitchell, and I stayed with the platoon until we got some replacements. And then Lieutenant Baxter sent me back. Was it 3 days later? I went back to the hospital. But we were down. We went from 28 to 11 guys here in just a couple of days, and so there was absolutely no leadership left except for the lieutenant. And so I stayed with the platoon.
How does, I mean, you've recounted these stories, I'm sure, a number of times. Of course, you've recounted these stories in your memoir. But what does it feel like? I mean, as you're sharing this story, it's not just words, right? I'm sure that there's something else going on. What words would you describe to use, what it's like to share these stories again? Because I'm hearing words and I'm forming images in my mind, but of course the images I'm forming in my mind are pure fabrications. The images you have in your mind are the real thing. And I imagine that this must, be associated with some kind of feeling or something like that. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but how if that is so, how would you describe that?
Well, it's difficult to talk about those days, and I try to do the best I can, for these projects or even for my book. It kind of reminds me, when you see news stories of the World War II veterans, and this was, 10 years ago, and they start crying when they're talking about their time at war. And I said, why are these old guys crying? And then it's right here when I'm talking now, there's tears in my eyes. I mean, it's very emotional. Because I think about the 13 guys, and I think about the guys that were wounded. I mean, like Okino, he came home. He was in the hospital 2 years. He's been 100% disabled ever since he was 19 years old. And but he's alive. So there's more impact than just the guys that were died. The guys that were wounded too. The guys out of our platoon that I found, there's 8 of the guys already dead from Agent Orange.